Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. On a chilly afternoon in November of 1894, Carrie Peitzel sat in the Philadelphia police station, nervously wringing a handkerchief in her hands. Seated across the table from her was a man, a detective. The detective flipped through the documents nestled in a folder in front of him, occasionally looking up to observe her. She gulped and waited patiently. The documents were obscured from her view, but she had an idea what they were about. They were investigating an insurance fraud scheme perpetrated by her husband, Benjamin, and a friend. Her involvement led to her arrest. But instead of asking her about her complicity, he asked her different questions. Specifically, where were her husband and children? She said she didn't know, and honestly, she didn't. She tried to remember the last place Benjamin's friend mentioned he was staying. England? Mexico? Maybe it was El Salvador or South America. Intimidated by his silence and the weight of the situation, she added that his friend had taken her around the country to look. And the children, the detective asked? She admitted she was a little worried. She told him she'd been feeling ill, and with a toddler to take care of, Benjamin's friend had offered to look after them. 13-year-old Alice, 9-year-old Nellie, and 7-year-old Howard Robert. He had given her $500 of the insurance money he'd collected from the scheme. It was very kind of him. Still holding the file, the detective asked her, had it really been almost 2 months since she'd seen any of them? She nodded, noting a quality in his voice that almost seemed kind. No, she thought. Woeful. How do you know they're alive? He asked. His question made her flinch. Benjamin's friend told her so, she replied. Filling the torturous silence, she said he'd looked after them like they were his very own, until they got separated, that was, and even continued to take the letters she wrote them to the post office himself, just to make sure they were delivered to the proper address. The detective listened, but it didn't matter. The words were more to reassure herself anyway. Truth be told, she said, she was relieved to be arrested. Surely the police would be able to locate them. She knew Benjamin's friend had been doing his best, but they always seemed to be a step behind. Unable to put the woman through any more, the detective sighed and handed her a packet. I'm sorry, he said. Turning the envelopes over, she recoiled. That can't be, she said with tears in her eyes. There must be some mistake. Her husband's friend, Herman Webster Mudgett, had so many names. He was known as Pratt, as Howard, as Jones, and as Adams. Carrie Peitzel knew him by another name, H. Holmes. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. You might be familiar with the tale of H. Holmes, America's first serial killer, suspect number 1 in the Jack the Ripper killings, architect of Chicago's murder castle. Sentenced to hang, he escaped and lived a life of luxury in South America. And if you believe any of that, he's conned you too. don't feel bad. Mudgett was a talented liar. So much so that nearly every detail about his life has been obscured in some way by his invention, with modern scholars reaching no more agreement than the ones from his day. Adding to the challenge is another undeniable fact. His crimes were committed at the height of yellow journalism, a time in American media where objective reporting was replaced with shocking headlines and outrageous stories. Driven by rival newspaper giants Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst and their perpetual pissing contest, information was replaced with innuendo, substance by sensationalism. And fact-checking? Forget about it. More than just a matter of which political party was favored by the publisher, the news of the late 19th and early 20th century resembled the outlandish tabloids found at grocery checkout lines. Sources were rarely vetted and frequently paid. Rumors, exaggeration, and personal attacks were common. And if photographic evidence didn't support the line they were selling, they just used illustrations and caricatures instead. While Mudgett remains solely responsible for his acts of treachery and murder, yellow journalism contributed to the heartbreak of his victims' loved ones as well as enabling him to continue to manipulate and even profit from these acts, right up until his death. Which, spoiler alert, didn't happen in South America. But that's just one little tidbit of his haunted hustle. You'll see soon enough. According to news articles published at the time of his arrest, as well as his autobiography, H.H. Holmes was the child of wealthy English immigrants. His father, a raging alcoholic, beat him mercilessly. He displayed incredible intelligence as a child, mastering every lesson his schoolmaster put in front of him before he reached his teens. It was also during his formative years that he developed an obsession with death, trapping pitiful animals and performing makeshift surgeries on them. He was a very popular chap in school, but he was also bullied mercilessly. He could handle himself, though. He kidnapped his tormentor and killed him, marking his first murder. No one ever found the body. And if you think this sounds too incredible to be true, you're right. Herman Webster Mudgett was born May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His parents, Levi and Theodate, lived a relatively modest life. They were most likely Methodist, and the lack of criminal or other public records suggests they were an average, unassuming couple. Following his capture, his parents, cousins, and siblings were approached by reporters hungry for exclusives. Many gave interviews. No one wanted to appear to support him. There's no evidence Levi cruelly abused anyone. Each told the press they were abhorred by his crimes, and none of them laid blame upon their patriarch. They seemed just as confused by his actions as the rest of the public. And in fact, years before the murder, Mudgett named a daughter after his mother, suggesting at least a semblance of a connection existed. Just as untrue are claims of his exceptionally high intelligence and a preternatural thirst for knowledge. There are no records of little Mudgie's time in primary school that suggest he was anything more than an average student. And it's not like this wouldn't have been noted. Gifted children were a subject of town talk back then as well. That wouldn't have been something the press would miss, especially the local ones. The only one convinced of his uncanny criminal genius was Mudgett himself. But then again, most con artists are. As to the claim to have trapped animals and performed surgery on them as a child, we have only his word for that too. None of it can be substantiated by other sources. While an interest in anatomy and surgery can't be denied, there are also no genuine interviews from any unbiased source, not Mudgett's family, fellow parishioners, neighbors, or peers, that confirms his fascination with death was anything more than normal childhood curiosity. His claims to having killed and dissected a classmate while in primary school is also complete crap. No child was reported missing in Gilmanton while he was there, something that would have occurred even back then. It's not like a neighbor would sit down to dinner without noticing they were missing someone. So this too is spunk. Whatever his motivations truly were, his interests led him to pursue a career in medicine. Mudgett graduated primary school at the age of 16, the standard age at the time, and enrolled in medical school soon after. On July 4th, 1878, he married Clara Lovering in Alton, a town just 12 miles away. Her story only further serves to torpedo his autobiography. She too was fairly unremarkable, and if his parents were wealthy, eccentric, or foreign, he wouldn't have married a girl right up the block, especially if he were such an exceptional intellect. The couple welcomed their son Robert Lovering Mudgett about 20 months later, while they were making their home in Loudon, another town the same 20-mile radius. Around this time, Mudgett enrolled in the University of Vermont in Burlington, but left school after 1 year. The 18-year-old later claimed he was dissatisfied with the school, no doubt due to the fact he was either frustrated by not being recognized as a savant or seen as the scammer he was. Either way, he bounced back and entered the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in 1882. A mediocre student, he worked at the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herdman, the chief anatomy instructor. It's said the two engaged in grave robbing to supply the program's medical cadavers. And this may finally be a detail that bears true. Body snatching was a black market industry at the time, with the crime being a misdemeanor in most areas, so it was rarely enforced. Just kidding. This too is probably exaggerated. The body snatching industry was dominated a little farther east, with Baltimore, Maryland reigning supreme. Its location on a major railroad hub made circulating fresh stock a breeze, and the temperate coastal climate, paired with its proximity to ocean currents kept above freezing, made retrieving new products something that could be done almost year-round. In Michigan, where freezing ground temperatures normally strike in October and can remain that way well into April, this just wasn't feasible. But that's not to say Mudgett failed to recognize an opportunity when he saw it. It was in that lab he devised his first con. Mudgett's first documented crimes were insurance scams, in which he created fake identities and took out life insurance policies on them. Instead of stealing bodies to bring in, he took them right out the front door. Stealing cadavers from the lab, he burned or disfigured them, then planted the body to make it appear the person had been killed in an accident. When the body was later discovered, he would approach the insurance company and collect. His plot was so lucrative and his success so impressive, at least to him, that he openly bragged to classmates about his activities, claiming the payouts put his way through college. It's clear Clara didn't see any of it. Classmates later said he treated his wife terribly, often violently. By 1884, she and their son moved back to New Hampshire. Each would see little of him again. He also passed his medical exams that year and was almost prevented from graduating when a widowed hairdresser accused him of making a false promise of marriage to her. But boys will be boys, and the whole thing was considered and summarily dismissed. Relocating closer to home after graduation, Mudgett worked several jobs in his related field. In Philadelphia, he was hired as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital, a kind of orderly or nurse's aide position, but he quit after just a few days. There are also rumors that around that same time he relocated to Moores Forks, New York, where he had been seen with a little boy who later disappeared. According to the story, no investigation took place, and he quickly left town. As you can imagine, this was also a tale invented by Mudgett in the media and is probably equal parts fiction and hot gas. Police investigated missing children in the 19th century, although inquiries were admittedly rudimentary. But children missing enough to be noticed with a suspect would also be reported to the department soon after the disappearance, instead of 10 years later to an eager, paying reporter. After the hospital, he did work at a drugstore where a boy died after taking medicine that was purchased there. He denied any involvement in the child's death, but immediately left town. Not having found much success after college in terms of money or status, he returned to running cons, stealing bodies for insurance scams and cleaning and selling the skeletons from bodies that wouldn't suit this purpose. Had he kept the racket small and humble, he may have been able to fly under the radar for quite a while. But that wasn't his style. Mudgett got cocky and greedy and pushed the limits by filing more and more claims. It wasn't long before he attracted attention. Taking the proceeds, he went in search of a new start, with a new name. There are a couple theories as to how our budding maniac arrived at the name Henry Howard Holmes, one being in deference to the famous detective himself. Think that's true? Nope. Arthur Conan Doyle published tales of his characters' adventures in various magazines a full 2 years after Mudgett's move from New England, and it would be another 6 or 7 years before the adventures of Sherlock Holmes were compiled into a novel. It's more likely that Mudgett wanted a name that sounded charismatic and debonair, more in line with his carefully crafted persona. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes would suit this nicely. He was far enough removed from his true name to distance himself from his reputation as a con artist and would impede the search of any previous victims seeking retribution. But he could still be recognized. So, in August 1866, he relocated to Chicago. Chicago at the turn of the century was an ideal place for Mudgett to hide. Teeming with ambition and opportunity, it was a budding metropolis of industry and a gateway between the Midwest and the coast. Because of its position between the Great Lakes, Mississippi River, and major railway hubs, thousands of people crossed through every year. Many still decided to make a home there. For a con artist, it was perfect. When he arrived, he came across Elizabeth Holton's drugstore with a help wanted sign in the window. He liked what he saw. A visibly shaken, vulnerable woman. He straightened his tie and went inside. The widow found the talkative, average-looking man charming, with a familiarity that seemed out of place, but still comfortable. He seemed genuinely sympathetic, and she soon found herself telling him all sorts of things. Like how much she still missed her late husband, and how overwhelmed and exhausting it was running the business in his absence. Mudgett, now calling himself Holmes, told her he was a doctor, and, unmarried, would be able to work whenever she needed him. She hired him on the spot. He wasted no time ingratiating himself to his new community, particularly the ladies. Months into his job, he married 24-year-old Myrta Belknap. Did he murder Clara, you may ask? No, but he didn't divorce her either. He filed for divorce a few weeks later, alleging infidelity on her part. But his claims couldn't be substantiated on account of them being flat-out lies, so the suit went nowhere. Surviving paperwork suggests she was probably never even informed of the suit. With Myrta, he had one daughter, Lucy Theodate Holmes. The newly minted family man, or as far as anyone in Chicago knew, was a hard-working employee and eventually bought the store. He also bought the building it was housed in, as well as other properties across the street, in order to build the murder castle. Wrong. It was for the World's Fair. The World's Fair was a global exposition celebrating progress and ingenuity. It was kind of like Disney World, Paris Fashion Week, and Firefest all rolled into one. An estimated 27 million people flocked into the city to check out the latest modern inventions. Marvels like the Ferris wheel, the zipper, voice recording, and Cracker Jacks. That kind of influx would need accommodations, places to sleep, and pick up assorted snacks and other amenities. Ever the entrepreneur, Mudgett decided to build a hotel, later dubbed the Castle by locals. The term was tongue-in-cheek. The building was moderately sized and largely unremarkable, but according to Mudgett, when complete, would include offices, shops, commercial space, and apartments. At least that's what he told investors. In reality, it was just a bigger scam. Adopting a sales pitch eerily similar to the movie Field of Dreams, he approached neighbors, customers, and other locals to invest in his hotel. He used the same strategy to hire contractors and buy furnishings on credit, goods and services that were rendered but never paid. As each vendor grew frustrated by Mudgett sticking them with the bill, they stopped working or supplying his orders. Which didn't matter to him. He just took the same pitch to the next supplier and repeated the act. It was for this reason, not due to some dark, sinister side interest, that Mudgett's building contained such a maze of poorly planned architecture. As construction workers didn't get paid, they quit, causing mistakes and delays, which was fine by him. His intention was never to complete the building in the first place. Finished products don't need startup investors. The best way to keep duping them was to ensure the building continued into perpetuity. Constantly having to pick up where another team left off led to many disconnects and refurbishments, which is why no formal plans for the building actually existed. But multitudes of expert contractors and workers with free access easily dispel later stories that the castle contained anything nefarious. If there were really soundproof rooms, booby traps, and gas chambers, they would have noticed. So too are the rumors of Mudgett operating a crematory to dispose of his victims' bodies. The closest apparatus he had was a furnace used to blow and mold glass in a building he owned across the street. And while it's possible he could use it to dispose of some evidence, it would be too small to handle a big, fleshy body without limbs sticking out and the glass factory smelling like a smokehouse, so it's very unlikely. Nor were there trapdoors, peepholes, stairways to nowhere, or chutes that led to the basement, dissecting tables, or stretching racks. The building was just shoddily completed. A worker once put his foot through the roof while trying to make some repairs. While terrifying, it wasn't exactly the death trap legend would have us believe. And those weren't the only ones with their hands out for payments. Suppliers of furniture and other goods wanted their money too, and when they didn't get it, would come to the castle to repossess. But what they couldn't find, they couldn't retrieve. Those secret rooms Mudgett later claimed were spaces he used to capture and imprison his victims. They were actually concealed storage rooms designed to hide property he resold in St. Louis for pennies on the dollar. He must have been pretty pleased with the cleverness of his plan. St. Louis was hours away by rail, but worlds away for the lines of communication. A newspaper's readership never went outside its municipal boundaries. Police seldom paid attention to crimes occurring in other departments, and traveling to another big city made it even less likely he'd be caught. And no matter what he got for it, it was all profit. He was never going to pay for it anyway. Time and again, vendors sent agents to the house to reclaim their goods, and time and again, agents returned empty-handed, stating the house was empty. On the rare occasions he did get caught, he usually got away with it anyway. Once a vault manufacturer sent its agents to repossess a safe. Unable to hide it in a secret room, he bolted it to the walls and floor and had it encased in a room with neither a door nor window large enough to move it through. Take your safe, he dared, but don't mar a single inch of this house in doing so. Unable to figure out how to accomplish this, they let him keep the safe, which he sold after another set of tradesmen removed the flimsy walls around it. The basement truly was a crime scene, but not the way he later told reporters. It was his workshop, in which he built a machine he claimed could make lamp gas out of water. While hosting an inspector for the utility company one day, further proof of the lack of a murder dungeon, Mudgett ran his so-called invention for 10 hours, impressing the man who agreed to share the news. His superiors weren't so easily fooled. Another company inspector quickly determined the invention appeared to make gas out of water by tapping the gas main. They charged him 10 cents for the gas and confiscated his device, leaving a large hole in its place. Convinced the hole was too good to waste, he filled it with soda water, and the next day was selling natural spring water in his basement to gullible neighbors. After his enterprise had petered out, he manufactured miracle cures and sold stock in a restaurant he didn't even own. The sheer number of his schemes and monetary loss to his victims soon drew plenty of attention. He was sued in city courts more than 50 times, all of which were well reported in the Chicago newspapers, as were the frequent visits of the police who accompanied bill collectors with court orders. Again, eager to see justice served and therefore determined to examine every inch of the building they could, none of these witnesses reported seeing anything like the death dungeon, torture cells, and gas chambers later reported. And neither did any of the tenants and customers that frequented the property as well. The reason? They didn't exist. Eventually, word got around town and attention in the media began to accumulate, earning Mudgett a solid reputation as a credit cheat. Unable to lure companies into lending him any more cash or assets, he changed tactics, returning to insurance scams and horse theft. Again, the railway was an ideal accomplice, taking him throughout the country to avoid detection. He also took on a partner, a tenant named Benjamin Freeland Peitzel. The married father of 5 traveled to Chicago during the World's Fair in order to exhibit a coal bin he'd invented. Upon meeting Mudgett, the two found they had much in common. Both were New England transplants whose criminal activities almost gave them a high. They soon teamed up, and Mudgett utilized Peitzel as his right-hand man for several of his schemes. Insurance scams and horse theft had become quite lucrative. Horses brought a good price in St. Louis and were much easier work than the random murder for the cadaver market. Mudgett also placed ads in newspapers offering employment and vacancies at the castle. He placed other ads in those same newspapers presenting himself as a wealthy man looking for a wife. Opposed to a serial killer thirsty for his next murder victim, his ads suggested he was trolling for vulnerable women to exploit, either financially or sexually. One of the first to answer his ads was Julia Smythe and her husband, Ned Connor. The two took jobs at the pharmacy, and they and their 5-year-old child, Pearl, moved into the building. Mudgett orchestrated the couple's duties so as to separate them much of the time and used the isolation to seduce Julia. When news of the affair reached Connor, he quit his job and moved away, abandoning her and their daughter. Now dependent upon Mudgett to support them, Julia remained in the castle and continued the affair. She and her daughter disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1891. When people started asking, Mudgett initially said they left unexpectedly to visit her dying sister, but then changed his story and said they fled in the middle of the night to escape Connor, who was abusive. In the spring of 1892, 23-year-old Emmeline Segrand responded to an ad and was hired as Mudgett's personal secretary. Like he had with Julia, Mudgett showered her with attention and charm, and soon the relationship became romantic. Things had cooled down between the pair by December, and other tenants remarked that she had seemed to have lost interest in him. Emmeline was last seen later that month. When her parents searched for her, they were informed that she had left to marry a man named Robert Phelps. The source of this information? Her boss, of course. The following year, while in the process of creating the Yates-Campbell Company, another front to shill mortgaged items in which he used fake identities to impersonate both Yates and Campbell, Mudgett made the acquaintance of 24-year-old Minnie Williams. Striking up a fast friendship, he offered her a job at the hotel as his personal stenographer, which she accepted. It may have been love at first sight. The flirtatious doctor and former actress seemed to get along quite well. She was a pretty young girl with a charming accent and ties to Texas. It may have also been her trust fund that attracted Mudgett. She and her sister inherited property and cash in the amount of about $50,000 after their uncle passed away. Either way, it appears that Minnie was quite taken by the dashing doctor. In addition to becoming another one of his sexual conquests and con victims, she also appears to have been an accomplice. The following month, he and Minnie, presenting themselves as husband and wife, rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Upon signing the lease, he insured the flat for $60,000, alleging the resident housed important papers and other valuables. Soon after, the apartment burned. When he approached the insurance company to file a claim, they refused to pay, suspecting more than coincidence was at play. He then persuaded her to transfer the deed to her property in Fort Worth to a man named Alexander Bond, another alias of Mudgett's. He actually served as notary through the process. Not long after, he signed the deed over to Peitzel under his alias Benton T. Lyman. The couple then reached out to Minnie's sister Nanny to visit. In her letter, Minnie wrote she was to be married and would leave shortly for Europe. Nanny wrote a similar letter to their aunt in July, announcing her plans to accompany them. Neither Minnie nor Nanny were ever seen alive again, but their names and connections were frequently exploited by Mudgett in subsequent scams. That summer, the castle's third floor, which Mudgett described in policy applications as the World's Fair Hotel, caught fire. Having heavily insured the structure and its contents with no fewer than 4 insurance companies, the companies refused to pay and sued him for fraud. As part of the proceedings, fire inspectors and investigators hired by the insurance companies examined the building and determined the cause of the fire to be incendiary in nature. They also found the property absent of any valuables Mudgett had claimed were destroyed or any murder or torture apparatus. He was arrested, but soon released. Having exhausted the insurance scam angle, much as he had with credit fraud, and those same companies now pressing to prosecute him for arson, Mudgett skipped town and headed to Texas, in hopes of reaping an inheritance from the Williams sisters. Claiming to be their legal heir, a simple act once he succeeded in establishing the relationship with the sisters' letters, he took ownership of a plot of land in Fort Worth, intent on building a new castle and recreating his credit scams all over again. While attracting marks and accumulating enough goods to make it worth a trip to St. Louis, Mudgett and Peitzel decided to steal more horses, and in July 1894, they were nearly caught. As police searched for him in Texas, he was picked up in St. Louis the next time he arrived with more stolen goods. While awaiting his arraignment, he concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company by taking out a policy on himself and faking his death. He shared the scheme with cellmate Marion Hedgepeth, a convicted outlaw serving a 25-year sentence. Mudgett offered Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted to do the job. The convict recommended Jephthah Howe, a young St. Louis attorney who thought the idea was brilliant and agreed to play a part. After making bail, he followed through with his so-called demise, but failed. The insurance company was onto him and refused to pay. Not wanting to draw any more resistance or attention, he let it slide, only to try the same plan again. He knew a guy who would be ideal. We'll pick it up again next week. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.